You left the safety on.
WWE does the raid. We are talking the Marine 6 Close Quarters. This one directed by James Nunn, and this stars Mike the Mizain, Miziane? I don't know how you pronounce that, but there you go. Michaels, wrestling legend, of course, and Becky Lynch, known here by her real name, Rebecca Quinn. Now, Becky Lynch is probably going to be a main draw of this one, I expect, because she happens to have just had this kind of big push due to a particularly bloody segment in the TV show WWE Raw and then SmackDown, and something that's happened kind of by accident really, but you can get some brawl, and she's ended up looking like a complete badass. And to be honest with you, I haven't watched SmackDown and Raw for many years, not since really kind of the Attitude Era, but I kind of saw this all over social media, so I was kind of intrigued to check out Becky Lynch and this segment, and very impressive it was too, and she does seem to have quite the kind of the presence around her, so I'd be interested to kind of keep an eye on what she does going forward, because ultimately this makes me less familiar with The Miz. I have actually seen previous Marines films with him, but I've never really kind of seen much of him in wrestling. I watched the odd pay-per-view, but until now I haven't really watched the TV shows for a long time. But this one, like I've said, also has Shawn Michaels, who is of course a Hall of Famer, or legend, whatever you want to say. So there's 6 in this series. Now, The Miz has been in this since the 3rd one, I would say, and here he is as an EMT, and he's out with Shawn Michaels, who is an old veteran buddy of his, and they are going around areas where there is ultimately sort of squatters, homeless people, trying to kind of like give aid to other vets. And it just so happens that there's this kind of like old dilapidated building, I think it's like a corn factory or something, is being used by a gang of Irish criminals. Now, Becky Lynch, or Rebecca Quinn, being of Irish heritage, obviously they kind of, I'm assuming, worked that in for her accent. And they basically have kidnapped this young girl to try and get her brother to hang a jury in a kind of a high profile case that's kind of going on. And The Miz and Shawn Michaels stumble upon this and ultimately have to try and rescue this girl and face down Becky Lynch and her army of goons. Now, I say it's like the kind of the raid because ultimately the majority of this movie sort of takes place within this kind of like this large kind of factory, and just kind of like the raid, you're kind of going by trying to escape, trying to kind of get out various kind of levels of bad guys, and we have a variety of different kind of sub-bosses, shall we say. So let's talk about what works and what doesn't work with the Marine 6 Close Quarters. They say close quarters because a lot of this movie is without guns. Certainly the first half of this movie, the bad guys don't want to use guns because they don't want to hit this girl who's a hostage of theirs. Well, it does seem they do play fast and loose to this, because there are instances where people will clearly have a clean shot at our heroes, but they don't take it because that rule has been set up. Because ultimately we want to see lots of fist fights, but they seem to abandon that rule later on. So it's a little bit kind of fast and loose with that kind of particular command from Becky Lynch's kind of head boss. But nonetheless, it makes for quite an exciting kind of like sequences with our guys ultimately trapped within this kind of building, trying to find a kind of a way out to escape down various kind of flights of this particular kind of building. And there are some very kind of well choreographed action sequences, as you'd expect with these guys. These guys are obviously professional doing this on a day-to-day basis. So you can expect some good action sequences, and they deliver on that. I think there are some kind of really fun kind of like takedowns. There's also some nice kind of banter between Shawn Michaels' character and The Miz, who are kind of like almost kind of keeping score about various different things. I thought that was some sort of quite nice. I think Becky Lynch does what she can with this kind of role. It's somewhat kind of one-dimensional, which we'll come on to, but she's makes for a good kind of villainess. And I like the fact that she's ultimately the end bad guy, despite her having this like huge, great big kind of henchman guy who's not actually a wrestler, I believe, but I've seen him in a couple of other movies. So that's all quite fun. The plot is it's fairly kind of simple, easy to follow, goes at a good pace as you'd probably expect with a WWE movie. It's not too deep, again, like you'd probably expect. So what doesn't work? So Becky Lynch, nothing to do with her so much, but she's really got nothing to do in this movie. She's just a bad guy shouting orders, and we don't really get any sense of character from her, which obviously they couldn't kind of like guess that she'd have this spiking popularity just when this movie comes out. But nonetheless, she's pretty good in it, but she doesn't really have a lot to do. She just kind of shouts orders at guys and has an action scene much herself, which is very good. But nonetheless, that's pretty much all there is to it. The bad guys are super kind of like underdeveloped here and just goons, basically. This movie is one cliche after another, and there's going to be one here that is meant to, without going into spoilers, there is a scene that happens which is very reminiscent of lots of other scenes that you've seen in films, that is meant to have a real emotional impact within the movie. But it comes across like a parody. It's so OTT cheesy, so ridiculously trite, that it almost seems like a similar scene done in like a parody movie, in one of these kind of like scary movie type things, airplane type things, like a scene that takes the piss of scenes that do this in real movies. It is so cheesy, and what makes it even more hilarious is that The Miz is trying to kind of, this is big emotional thing that happens in the movie. And, you know, it's meant to be this kind of real heartfelt moment, and it just comes across as a real misfire. Down to the direction, the overuse of slow-mo, the kind of the music, unfortunately the acting on this particular part, it is OTT cheesy, you know, typical kind of like heroic things that are happening. Yeah, it doesn't work. They went a bit too far with this one, trying to kind of make that particular setup. You'll know it when you see it. I've got to say, this movie does favour kind of cheesiness over realism. So I compared this movie to The Raid, and The Raid has some truly visceral fight scenes and is an excellent action movie. And I feel the movie could have done that, but it doesn't. It just kind of goes for more kind of cheap, gaggy kind of fights, kind of like no real kind of. They're well choreographed. They look good for a kind of this sort of movie. But I can't help but compare it to The Raid because it's such a similar film in regards to kind of plot. But the fight scenes feel a little bit undercut by some of the humour here. So I feel like though I kind of enjoyed some of the banter, it does ultimately undercut some of the action. This movie ends up feeling more like a TV show, like the TV kind of show fighting. If you ever watch things like Arrow, that sort of thing, it's well done, but just never feels that visceral, that kind of impactful. And when it does try to have stakes, you'll see what happens. You'll see what I mean. And I've got to say, the ultimate fate of Becky Lynch's character struck me as a little cold by the people involved. Again, I'm not going to give away spoilers, but it just seems like this almost seems a little bit, well, cold on the person's front. Can't really say what, but why, without kind of giving away huge spoilers there. I will say this movie does do something that I wasn't expecting. There is a kind of a twist within this movie that I've kind of hinted about, but I wasn't expecting it, so hats off for doing something like that. But I've got the feeling, obviously we'll see more of this kind of series and maybe go in a slightly different direction. Overall, I've got to say this movie is entertaining. I feel it has a lot to offer if you like this series to this kind of point. I don't feel it has much in the way of character development for Becky Lynch's character or our protagonists ultimately. But it's a fun film for lots of kind of like for fight scenes, and it does have a fairly decent kind of shootout scene towards the end. So overall, this movie is super cheesy, and you know, you'll see feats on here that almost are superhuman. There's a jump that I'm not going to say what happens, but there's a jump here that is just eye-rollingly ridiculous. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. It's pretty average, because there's some highs here, but there's also some real lows. So ultimately it's going to shake down to pretty much an average action movie. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.